From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And here's what's ahead. K-State's Justin Waggoner is standing by to talk about nutritional management of replacement heifers heading into their first breeding season. The main factors there being the target weight for them to reach at breeding time and the timing and pace of weight gain to get there. Justin will cover all of that for us. Then K-State's Jane Lingenfelser is back to cite the top-performing hybrids in K-State's 2020 Grain Sorghum Performance Test, the report on which has just been released for you producers to reference. And later on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham on selecting vegetable garden seed to be started as transplants in the coming weeks. All that here on this Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Glad to have you tuned in for another Agriculture Today. Well, beef cattle producers, thoughts here on replacement heifer development. As we're talking once more with one of K-State Research and Extension's beef systems specialists, Justin Waggoner, based in southwest Kansas. Justin recently put some comments together on this subject in the Beef Tips newsletter out from K-State. And we're into that time of the year for the spring calving herds for sure, Justin, where this is one of those management priorities for producers who do prefer to develop their own replacements.
Yes, as we look at heifer development programs, and I think it actually applies to, in some cases, producers may choose to raise their own heifers, but also we have a lot of producers that will go out there and buy young heifers with the intent of making them into replacement females. And then, the third option that some producers choose to do is to, purchase those as bred females. And so this really applies to those producers that are going to either raise some of their own replacement heifers or those that might buy some heifers and then look at ultimately turning them into replacement females.
Well, what constitutes heifer development? You say there are two factors prominent here.
Sure. So as I look at the process of building a heifer development program, and I think a lot of times what happens is we really want programs that are going to be a one-size-fits-all. There's really some factors to where it's it depends on, the number of heifers, what access you have in terms of resources, availability also figures into that as well. So for me, the two factors that we start with, and this is kind of the very fundamental type questions, are what's the desired target weight that those heifers are going to be developed to prior to breeding? We've got what I call kind of a higher target and then a lower target that is, kind of commonly used out there in the industry. And then there's also the strategy of how we're going to get those heifers to gain that weight as we go through the development period over the winter, ultimately getting into that breeding season that coming spring.
Let's look then at the weight targets that one is shooting for here. And this relates to the heifer's eventual ability to reach reproductive maturity, you say.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if we look at reproductive development or puberty, in heifers, that's going to be essentially both a function of age and body weight. However, in, most production settings, a lot of times we don't know the exact age of those heifers. It's pretty approximate. We often use body weight as a way of gauging that target. And so a lot of times what we do is historically we've kind of set development targets expressed as a percentage of mature weight. So one of the first considerations there is, okay, what's the mature weight of these females as a 5-year-old cow? We need to give some consideration to that as we develop that and think about that. Historically, we developed heifers to, let's say, a mature body weight target of 65% of their mature weight at breeding. Well, more recently, we've seen a movement towards developing heifers to lower target weights. 55% of mature body weight at breeding is kind of the number that gets thrown around. There's also some work that's been done at lower target weights, down in the 51, 52%. And really what's behind that strategy is using that as a means to lower those development costs. I.e., if we're not trying to grow those heifers as big, that might save us some money down the road, as we don't need more of an aggressive nutrition program to get those kind of gains. However, the trade-off with those lower development targets is that a lot of times a few more heifers may not be cycling at the breeding season, simply because we've applied a little. It's a function of both age and body weight, so lighter heifers sometimes may not be cycling. So we may have to increase the number of females if we have a target number of replacement heifers that we need to meet those targets. So it's kind of a give and take there. So, as we look at, when might it be appropriate to look at a higher development target? Well, if we've got a relatively small herd size, maybe we raise our own replacement females. If we've got 100 head of cows, we've got 12 heifers that we feel are the quality that we want to keep back. It might be worth that additional investment of developing those heifers to a larger target weight prior to breeding, just simply to ensure that a larger percentage of those females are going to be cycling and breeding back. So, that's another aspect of these heifer development programs. A 55% or a lower target weight may not be appropriate for every producer. If you're a larger enterprise, you've got access to more heifers, or you can go out there and buy more heifers. And if they don't breed up, you've got an easy way to maybe run those through a commercial marketing channel into a feed yard. Hey, that lower development strategy might be the way to go. So certainly as we look at the answer to that question, there's some pros and cons associated with both of those targets.
Point is, you're going to tailor that target weight objective to your operation, its resources, its objectives, like you say. The other side of this, then, is determining how to get to that target weight, how to put gain on those replacement heifers. And this largely has to do with the pace and the timing of that program, you say.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we look at weight gain strategies, we say there's 3 strategies, and they're all pretty simple. We can simply put heifers on a relatively even rate of gain to achieve this predetermined target weight out in the future. We can also take heifers and we can develop them more aggressively early on post-weaning, and then look at, reducing that plane of growth slightly, albeit keeping them in a positive manner until that breeding target. We can also grow those heifers more slowly up front and then more rapidly as the breeding season approaches. All 3 of these strategies are acceptable, that you can use them and have a very limited impact, research indicates, on both reproductive performance as well as longevity and those type of things. So they're all viable strategies. And so what it comes down to is, once again, what resources are available and what kind of makes sense. And so, if we look at that even strategy, it's probably the most common that's used. A lot of times, we're looking at heifers at weaning time are going to weigh 500 pounds, let's say. So as we look at, depending on the mature weight target, those heifers may only need to gain 200 to 400 pounds over a period of, let's say, almost 6 months. And so we don't really need a very aggressive plan of nutrition to accomplish that in most cases. So that really facilitates an opportunity for some relatively low input, maybe in some extensive environments that we could put those heifers in. Wheat pasture could be an example. Even stalks with some supplementation might be, or even dormant native grass could work in there. And so fairly easy to manage in that even. It's relatively easy to get those kind of gains. If we look at the early development strategy where we put that weight gain on pretty rapidly post-weaning, the advantage of this particular strategy is those heifers are growing rapidly. We could hit those target weights a little bit earlier. It stimulates some cyclicity in those heifers. So we may see a greater percentage of those heifers that are beginning to cycle earlier. However, the big disadvantage of that strategy is that as we grow those heifers to larger weights, rather than maintaining an average of a 700-pound heifer throughout most of the winter months, we now may be looking at maintaining a heifer that maybe weighs 800 pounds for a longer period of time. So we've got a higher increased maintenance demands of that larger animal. If we look at that later strategy where we grow them slowly and then increase the nutrition as we get closer to the breeding season, we don't have those increased maintenance requirements because we've got that lower, the animal with that lower weight, lower maintenance requirement there. However, the biggest risk associated with that strategy is what happens if we get a really cold and wet winter. Do we have sufficient time to catch up on those heifers? And so if we've got some environmental risk where we may not be able to to hit those targets, or we're in a situation where we can't provide a check in there to see where those heifers are going to be at a particular time, there is a little bit more risk in terms of developing that strategy. If we're going to increase the plain nutrition and grow these heifers more rapidly later on as we get closer to the breeding season. But all three of those strategies are acceptable. And I think what producers really need to hone in on is, regardless of the development strategy that you use, what's really critical is that we keep those heifers on a positive plane of nutrition. We don't want to have them growing very rapidly and then decrease that. What can happen when we get that is we can create heifers that may start to cycle erratically. Some may even stop cycling and then start again. And so that positive plane of nutrition throughout the development period is really key for those heifers as we look at achieving that endpoint in terms of that weight target that has been predetermined and that we've established.
By the evidence of what you've said here, one can go at this any of several ways, but the point is there is no one set strategy or series of strategies that is an absolute for every operation, that the producer is going to have to analyze where they're at, where they want to be, and what's going to get them there, and then craft that development program accordingly.
That's absolutely correct, Eric. And the other consideration is to put a checkpoint in there. As you get 90 to 120 days prior to that expected breeding date, regardless of however you develop these heifers, it's coming in and doing a weight check, looking at that group, seeing where we're at, because at that point we've got sufficient time, regardless of what strategy you've used, we can alter that at that point. And, if those heifers are a bit behind, increase the supplementation, increase the rate of feeding. Maybe we catch them up a little bit.
Well, it is without a doubt a management commitment, but by the same token, it can provide a high-end payoff for the producer if they are intent on developing their own replacement heifers. We appreciate this overview. Justin, thanks. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Eric.
Justin Waggoner, he's a beef systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And we'll return with more on Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today continues now as we brought back in from the Department of Agronomy here at K-State, the individual who oversees the department's crop performance tests each and every year. As we promised some days back, we were going to bring you the Grain Sorghum Hybrid Performance Report for this year in sum. And so we do with Jane Lingenfelser along with us once more. And as we normally do, we let folks know at the outset, Jane, that those results in their final form are now available to folks online and otherwise.
That's right. They can be found at the KSCPT website. That address is agronomy. It's agronomy.ksu.edu, and the annual publication will come out as an insert in High Plains Journal magazine later this month, and will be in local extension offices soon after that. Also, an electronic copy of the book will be available from the K-State Research and Extension Digital Library. That address is www.ksre.ksu.edu/bookstore/crops.
And in a few moments, as we typically do, we'll be going over region by region those grain sorghum hybrids which stood out in the 2020 trials. But summarizing the growing season and as it impacted the trials, this was an exceptional year for grain sorghum production in Kansas, was it not, Jane?
It was. Overall, it was a very favorable growing season for grain sorghum. Planting was not delayed this year as it has been in the last few years and was mostly completed by the end of June. We had adequate temperatures and subsoil moisture for planting. There were intermittent dry spells during July and August, especially in central and north central Kansas, but grain sorghum is really built for that and did not seem to be too adversely affected. Hot temperatures during the summer were also not much of a factor, particularly the important nighttime temperatures when the crop is actively growing. And then later, freezing temperatures were also not much of a factor and occurred too late in the season to stop the physiological maturity of the sorghum. The crop was allowed to finish and conditions were good for dry down. And so generally across the state, harvest progressed well ahead of the last few years, and it was just a favorable and mild year.
And not with a total absence of pest pressure, but that was fairly manageable, was it not?
That's right. While it was generally very conducive for production, that didn't mean that it was entirely disease-free. The most important and prevalent disease of 2020 were stalk rots. We did see a lot of lodging caused by stalk rot at many of the performance trial sites this year, and those percentages can be found on the KSCPT website. In fact, the severity of Fusarium stalk rot was so bad at the irrigated site at Garden City that we ultimately abandoned that test.
And on the insect side, you say very quiet, comparatively speaking.
There were a few chinch bug infestations early on, but most areas had such good growing conditions early that the feeding had little effect. There were very few sugarcane aphid or sorghum headworm infestations. So overall, generally a very good year for grain sorghum.
As reflected in the test results, and you have highlights here, we remind folks that this is not an all-inclusive list, that there are more to consider, but these are the hybrids that stood out at the particular locales.
Right, and one of the drawbacks of a good growing season is that hybrids tend to perform pretty similarly when environmental stresses are not picking them off, so to speak. So it is not an exhaustive list. And I also like to thank Pioneer and Monsanto for providing the maturity check hybrids again this year.
So let's get right to it. Northeast Kansas, the dryland tests at 3 sites, you say.
That's right. We had Manhattan in Riley County. The average overall in Manhattan was 125 bushels. And the hybrids that did well in Manhattan, our early maturity check from Pioneer did well. Also, Dynagrow M71 GR91 and Galen Ward Seed 18072 did well in Manhattan. We also had Belleville in Republic County. The overall yields at Belleville were 104 bushels. And hybrids that did well, Golden Acres 3180B, DeKalb DKS 4407, and Dynagrow M60GB88 did well at Belleville. And also we had Beloit in Mitchell County. The average overall was 125 there as well. And hybrids that did well in Beloit, Polanski 5629. The medium maturity check from DeKalb did well. And Galen Ward Seed 2313 did well in Beloit.
Again, out of the Northeast region, Southeast Kansas. Originally, you had 2 test locations, but had to give up on one of them, you say.
Yes, our location at Parsons in Lebec County was drowned out early, unfortunately, but we were left with Ottawa in Franklin County. The overall yields at Ottawa averaged 138 bushels, and hybrids that did well in Ottawa, Dynagrow M69GB38, also our early maturity check from Pioneer, and Dynagrow, this is an experimental number, it's GX20564, did well at Ottawa.
On to central Kansas, and again, dryland production here at 2 locations where your average yield was quite good as well.
It was. We had Asaria in Saline County. The average at Asaria was 137 bushels, which is extremely good for Asaria. And hybrids that did well, Galen Ward Seed 2313. Pretty much all our maturity checks did well at Asaria. And also DeKalb DKS 4407 did well. We also had Hutchinson in Reno County. Yields were not quite as good, 65 bushels per acre. Lodging from stalk rot was quite an issue at Hutchinson, but hybrids that did well, Dynagrow GX19981, also Polanski 5719, and Advanta ADV G2275 did well in the central dryland region.
And then in western Kansas, your dryland trials. You had 4 sites here, and with the exception of one of the sites, those yields were right up there as well.
They were. We had Hays in Ellis County. The average overall was 121 bushels. Hybrids that did well at Hays, Golden Acres 2840B, also Dynagro GX 19981, and DeKalb DKS 3816 did well, all at Hays. We also had Colby in Thomas County. The average there was 123 bushels. Hybrids that did well, Polanski 5719, Advanta ADV G2106, and our medium maturity check from DeKalb did well at Colby. We also had Tribune in Greeley County with an average of 123 bushels, and hybrids that did well at Tribune, Golden Acres 2840B, S&W Seed SP43M80 did well. Also, Advanta ADV G1329 did well. And last but not least, Garden City in Finney County with an average of 54 bushels. Hybrids that did well at Garden City, our medium maturity check from Pioneer did well. Also, S&W Seed SP31A15 did well. And Galen Ward Seed 20132 did well in Garden City.
Once more, though, at the Garden City site, stock rot was the main culprit there.
It was.
And your irrigated trials with the Garden City version there, abandoned, as you said, Jane, because of the lodging, the hand of stock rot. But 2 sites you have data.
We had Hutchinson in Reno County. The average at Hutchinson was 190 bushels, so a good year at Hutchinson irrigated trials. Hybrids that did well, Advanta ADV XG224 did well, Dynagro GX 199881 did well, and Dynagro M69 GB38. All did well in the Hutchinson irrigated trial. Our test at Colby in Thomas County was abandoned due to some resistant weed competition that got away from them despite their very best efforts. And also our Garden City, as you mentioned, was abandoned due to very extensive lodging due to stock rots. But we were left with Tribune in Greeley County. The average overall at Tribune was 124 bushels. And hybrids that did well at Tribune, S&W Seed 74M21, also Golden Acres 3180B, and Advanta ADV G2275 did well at Tribune.
Well, as they always do, the tests rendered valuable performance information. There are many more hybrids, though, that were evaluated, of course. These were just the ones that tended to rise to the top at those locations. So you're advising folks to have a look at the entire report as they do their seed shopping.
That's right. I've only mentioned a small portion of the information that's available to help with hybrid selection decisions, and I would encourage sorghum producers to research the hybrids of interest and see how those did in the trials that are closest to their own management and environmental conditions. Again, the complete results are available at agronomy.ksu.edu, and the printed copies of the 2020 Kansas performance tests with grain sorghum hybrids will be available later this month as an insert in High Plains Journal magazine and will be in local extension offices soon after that.
We appreciate the word. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks for having me.
She's the agronomist in charge of K-State's crop performance tests, Jane Lingenfelser, covering the 2020 Grain Sorghum Performance Test around the state. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Agriculture Today continues now. Eric Atkinson with you. Well, the major newsmaker on the agricultural beat so far in 2021 has been the truly remarkable rise in grain prices day after day and rally after rally, carrying over a trend that started well before the calendar turned to the new year. Soybeans in particular have rallied to levels that haven't been seen since the market boom earlier in this last decade. Now, some ground was given in trading today, but nonetheless an ultra-bullish market. Of course, we'll be talking more about this with K-State grain market economist Dan O'Brien in his regular Friday visit tomorrow, especially how this is currently playing out in local grain basis around Kansas. But Dan wanted to offer encouragement to you producers today to be at the ready for pricing opportunities.
We've seen a run-up in the three major futures contracts that we watch: corn futures, soybean futures, and hard red winter wheat. For corn, trade above $5 on the March contract. Well, March and May on the high side up to 502 3/4, 502 1/2 on the high side for, again, March 21, May 21. Closed 495, 496. Strong prices. You look at the moving averages and other type of bounded trends, we're moving to the high side. Relative strength index, kind of a measure of momentum in the market, that we've been trading up into 88, 85. Generally, you get above 75, you're getting due for a downturn. I honestly think, Eric, that there'll come a time in the corn market where the high prices of corn inputs on ethanol and for livestock feeders will kind of bring a natural top to just how high you can run in the corn. Background on all this, of course, is dryness in South America, Argentina and Brazil, dock strike, government actions to hold back usage. The soybean market, again, we're trading back to beans in the teens, traded up to $13.76 and change on the January contract. March contract, which is now the traders lead, $13.78 1/4, up 14.5 yesterday. And again, fears in South America, the major soybean competitor for the U.S., and China's actions, et cetera, all in play. And China's actions also in play in the corn market. Forgot to mention that. But anyway, 13.61 close for the March contract, 61.5 yesterday, and just peas in the pod in terms of the same technical signals for soybeans as for corn, an overbought situation. However, on the soybean side, you're having soybean oil, soybean meal running up along with soybeans. So perhaps there's more upside that you could go on the beans if it's still going to go more, because, again, the two co-products are both running up with it. So if anything suffers on this, it's probably biodiesel with the input price. And then for wheat also has been running up along with these, but the technical signals aren't as strong. It's telling on yesterday's market where corn, March was up 3 cents, March soybeans up 14.5, March wheat down 5 3/4. So again, you're looking at the issue of U.S. wheat export competitiveness, and even with a cheaper U.S. dollar, you still run up to the place with U.S. prices that it can price us out of export competitive markets if we run up wheat too high. And you see it on the technicals too, not quite as strong a set of technical signals that prices are going to keep going higher for wheat, as you saw for corn and soybeans.
Well, growers are certainly appreciating these rallies. The question, Dan, is how does one position oneself to contend with the inevitable volatility here?
Well, normally we'd say options or something, but at the money option is going to cost a ton of money. Something out of the money for puts, that's closer down the cost of production. And again, you'd anticipate that we have a run-up. It could be an emotional run-up in the markets. And if we come back down, and again, I've just talked about how for corn that there's some issues to be reckoned with on the input industries in terms of high prices and what they do, that it would be good to take a look at these pricing opportunities on the lower end for options and maybe new crop pricing moves as well, given what you'd anticipate to be some move down lower, some reaction coming out in the spring. Really, and what's out there now will be how this run up in corn versus soybean prices, and also corn affecting grain sorghum prices as well, corn futures, what we'll do to acreage as we come on into this year. It's gonna if anything, we'll have to let the quote dust settle on these run-ups and then reassess where we stand as we make our final planning decisions for spring 2021.
Grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. Again, we'll hear more from Dan on tomorrow's broadcast. On we go now to this week's Kansas soybean update with Greg Akagi. Greg?
Holly Higgins is joining us. She is with Kansas Farm Bureau, but serves as co-director for the Women Managing the Farm Conference. And Holly, like many other meetings, this one's going to be a little different this year for the 2021 Women Managing the Farm. It will be a virtual conference.
It certainly will. And what we're hoping, though, is that going virtual will allow greater participation in this event. Sometimes women can't travel, to Manhattan where we normally host the event. But this way, they'll be able to get online. They'll be able to participate in all or part as we go along. But the good thing is that they will have access to all this information for 30 days after the event is over.
And it will be February 10th through the 12th this year. What's the theme for this year's conference?
This year's theme is creating community online and at home. What we've always prided ourselves in doing is bringing together female farmers, rural business leaders, and landowners. And we try to do it so that they have a supportive setting where the women can develop their skills, gain knowledge, and have available resources to stay competitive in the agricultural environment.
What are going to be some of the highlights of this year's conference?
We're going to have some practical sessions on machinery maintenance, fence building, doctoring cattle, fence law, estate planning, farm financials, crop insurance, and of course, we're going to add mental health and stress. For the $50 registration, they will have access to our keynote sessions, our breakout sessions, and the virtual resource library. Also, as added incentive, the first 100 to register for Women Managing the Farm this year will receive a swag bag full of goodies put in by all the sponsors.
Holly, events like this do not work out unless you have great sponsorship like Kansas Soybeans.
That's exactly right. Organizations like the Kansas Soybean, Kansas Farm Bureau, and many others have been with us from the get-go. Even though we were going virtual this year, we noticed no lack of support for these organizations for this great program.
As you mentioned, the registration fee is $50. What's the best way to register for this year's virtual conference?
Register at the Women Managing the Farm website. They will register on there and get all the information they need then for access for the program.
That is womenmanagingthefarm, all one word, .com. That is Holly Higgins, who was with Kansas Farm Bureau but serves as co-director of the Women Managing the Farm Conference. She joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
And Greg Akagi there. Many thanks, Greg. We'll return in a moment here on Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. You're in time for this week's horticulture segment, and we can legitimately talk about vegetable gardening at this point of the season, and that is referring to starting those garden transplants from seed, if that's something that you'd like to attempt. Well, some guidelines on making that happen now from our guest, horticulturist Ward Upham, K-State Research and Extension. So those home gardeners who are just itching to do something in a gardening sense, this is the perfect outlet for that, Ward.
That's right. We're not talking about actually planting those seed anytime soon, but you need to get that seed ordered, make sure it's in, and make sure you have everything ready by the time you get to the point where you may want to start growing some transplants. So that's probably going to be rather, in March rather than now, except for onions. Onions, you normally, if you're going to seed onions for transplants, you're going to put those in the latter half of this month. And so we aren't too far off from that, but most of our other transplants, we're talking March or maybe a little bit later.
The seed catalogs have arrived at folks' doorsteps. One of the things as they shop that you stress is purchasing quality seed.
Yeah, quality seed. If you're not going to a place that specializes in seed, just make sure that the date is fairly current. Most of our seed will last 3 years or more and still be okay. But as time passes, it loses some of its viability. And so if you go to a place like a garden center or a place that normally carries seed, then usually it's going to be current years or maybe the past year's seed, and that will be fine. The other thing to keep in mind is make sure you use good varieties. Kansas is a place where we often have stressful conditions. And so we do have a sheet that has recommended vegetable varieties that you can look at, or talk to your local garden center and see what works for them, or even your neighbors. Things that have proven themselves are where you want to start. Now, if you want to try something new, don't be afraid to do that. But you should really focus on those that have already proven themselves.
If you're edging into those newer things, do it on a limited basis. Don't put all of your seeds in one basket, so to speak. Here.
Yes, that's right.
Ordering seed, that's the one thing we can do right here and now, but folks can also think about preparing for the transplants.
That's right. So make sure you have your media, make sure you have your pots, make sure you have enough light. You know, if you have to put in some artificial light, now is the time to get that built. We actually will have a link to a video on how to make a very inexpensive plant light next week in our horticulture newsletter. And so you can look at that and see how that's done. It's just made out of PVC and then the fluorescent light, or you could use LEDs in that case.
Now, not any light setup will do. One has to regulate that to a certain extent. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. You don't want to use incandescent because incandescent gets too hot and you need those lights right on top of the plants, maybe 2 to 4 inches above the top. That's going to burn plants who use incandescents. But if you use either fluorescent or LEDs, that will work fine. You can get them close enough. They get enough light energy to get those plants off to a good start.
Can one get away with natural light for starting transplants?
You can try, but often it's really difficult. We are, even in March, we still have relatively short days and the light energy isn't as much. A lot of people don't realize that when that sun comes through our atmosphere, it cuts down on the amount of light that actually reaches the earth. During the summer, middle of summer, we'll have 10,000-foot candles of light. During the middle of winter, we'll have about 1,100. It's almost a tenth as much in the winter. And you need a lot of light in order to grow these transplants. So you can try to grow them in a south-facing window, but often they get a little spindly. And so it's better even a south-facing window to give them supplemental lighting with either fluorescent or LEDs.
You mentioned, Ward, the planting medium, but you might remind that not just any soil will do for this purpose.
Yeah, you don't want to pull soil out of your garden and use it to start your seed. There's 2 reasons for that. One is that very well may contain disease that may not harm an older plant, but those seedlings may get damping off and you may kill your seedlings. The other thing is that garden soil doesn't breathe well. In other words, you need to have oxygen for those roots. And if you don't have oxygen, the plants just don't thrive. And so if you use a potting soil or germination soil, that has the aeration and the water holding capacity you need in order to grow good transplants. So it's well worth the expense in getting something that is actually designed for starting seed.
So line up your soil medium, your flats, and your lighting. You also need to be picky about the location in which you'll grow those transplants in atmospheric terms, right?
Yeah, you have to be careful where you grow them in the sense that you don't want inside, you don't want them near heat registers, you don't want them near doors where they get cold blasts as the door opens, that type of thing. So it's somewhat of a protected area. And then just make sure that the temperature doesn't get too high. I mean, they would like to be 55 to 60 at night, maybe 65 to 70 during the day, and that'll help keep them stocky.
All of this sounds like it takes effort, and it does, but you've found, Ward, in talking with gardeners, that once they try starting their own transplants, they really find it an enjoyable process that will work for them.
That's right. And you can get exactly the varieties you want this way. Your local garden center should have a good selection, but if they don't have something you really do want to grow, you can grow it yourself.
Once more, get those garden catalogs out. Start pouring through your options there. Talk with your local garden center personnel likewise. And by all means, do take full advantage of the information on adapted vegetable types for Kansas growing conditions through K-State Research and Extension. The resources there are aplenty. And that website to access for all of that would be where, Ward?
The easiest way to find it is just do a search. Horticulture Information Center, Kansas, and I'll bring it up. And there we have links to the newsletter, we have links to our publications, we have links to a lot of different horticulture information that I think people will find helpful.
Do your homework, and with the intent of starting your own vegetable garden transplants here in the coming weeks, and we appreciate the word. Ward, thank you.
You bet.
horticulturist Ward Upham, K-State Research and Extension, to add a quick footnote to all of this before we sign off for the day. If you're inclined to use that old garden seed that you've saved from last year or years back, the best thing to do is germination test them. And here's how to do it. Place 10 seeds on a paper towel moistened with warm water. Cover those with a second moistened towel, and then roll up the towels. Place all of it inside a plastic bag with holes to allow air in, and then place that bag in a warm location, the top of a refrigerator, one of their suggestions. And then after the first week, check for germination, remove any sprouted seed, and check again then after another week. And then total up the numbers of sprouted seed. That'll give you the percent germination that you need to know. Again, go to this week's K-State Horticulture newsletter to reference that topic. That's our horticulture segment for this week, and our time is away for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.